The first time people noticed what Arthur Pendelton was doing, most figured the old man had finally gone eccentric. For 3 straight weeks that April, the southern canyon of Cochise County was filled with the grinding roar of a heavy-tracked excavator he'd rented from the city. Neighbors driving past on County Road 7 would slow their trucks, roll down their windows, and squint into the dust. A few pulled over entirely, cutting their engines just to witness the bizarre spectacle. They expected to see him prepping a new field, or maybe pushing back the tree line to expand his east pasture. Arthur had been farming that land for 43 years. There was always something being improved or mended. But this time was different. The old man was digging a hole. A massive, deliberate, carefully graded crater, right in the middle of 60 acres that used to grow some of the finest, plumpest soybeans in the county. By the time word reached the feed and supply store in the town center, the excavation was the size of a professional football field and deep enough to swallow a grown man whole without a trace. Most of Cochise County had already drawn the same conclusion. "He's building himself a fishing pond to retire into," said Gavin Vance at the diner. Gavin ran 300 head of black Angus on the land next door. "Man works his whole life, turns 70, and throws his money into a base pond to sit and pass the time. Can't say I blame him, but it's a hell of a waste." There were quiet laughs, a few raised eyebrows. People shrugged, laughed it off, and went back to their own business. Before that blazing summer was over, however, many of those same neighbors would wish they had possessed enough of that exact madness to dig a hole of their own. Arthur Pendelton was not the kind of man who explained himself to the world. He was 71 years old, with skin darkened and weathered by the Arizona sun, hands scarred and heavily calloused, and a stubborn habit of watching the sky with absolute gravity, the way young men today stare at their phones. He wasn't the loudest man at the co-op meetings, but when he spoke, everyone else automatically went quiet to listen. He'd planted cover crops before it was a trend, and rotated his fields before anyone called it sustainability. He had no interest in defending his decisions. If a thing made sense, he did it. If not, he stopped. So, when people curiously pried about what he was constructing down in the dirt, he gave the exact same answer every single time, flat and monotone. "A reservoir," he said. And that was all they got. Gavin Vance was the first to voice real, practical skepticism. As a cattleman, Gavin had watched the excavation grow day after day from across the barbed wire fence for 2 weeks before finally stepping over the property line. "You're pulling your most productive ground out of rotation, Arthur," Gavin said, his voice laced with pity. "That topsoil down there is good as gold." Arthur merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the heavy bucket clawing deep into the earth. "It is." Gavin waited for a longer explanation. But nothing came. Only the dry, harsh roar of the excavator's engine. Over at the Cochise County Feed and Supply, Bud Eckerman, the old mechanic who serviced half the farm equipment in the area, shook his head over his coffee. That heavy excavator rental alone is going to run Arthur $6,000 or $7,000. And for what? Maxine Trotter, who had managed the store for 30 years, took a more measured view. She said quietly, "Arthur's done things that didn't make sense to anyone at first. And then, time proved him right. Right then, Gerald Fitch, a retired conservation officer, looked out the dust-filmed window and squinted. He's sizing it like a watershed reservoir, not a backyard fish pond. That thing. It's built to hold an astronomical amount of water. No one paid much attention to Gerald at the time, because most people in Cochise Valley had forgotten or were simply too young to know what Arthur Pendelton had lived through in the dark summer of 1988. Back then, Arthur was only 33 years old, in the absolute prime of his farming life. But the dry season of 1988 nearly stripped away everything he owned. For 11 straight weeks, the Arizona sky offered not a single drop of rain, not a single shadow, of a cloud. Groundwater wells dropped until they pumped nothing but dry sand, and natural creeks turned into cracked mud resembling turtle shells. Arthur hauled water by hand, day in and day out, his palms blistered and raw, pushing himself to total exhaustion, just to keep his livestock alive under the 113 degrees Fahrenheit heat. In the end, he still lost 20% of his crops, his cattle withered away, and it took 4 grueling years of back-breaking debt just to clear his name with the bank. Standing over the desiccated carcasses of his livestock by the dried-up creek bed that year, Arthur swore a silent oath to himself. He would never let nature back him into a corner like that again. For the next 30 years, while others focused on getting rich or buying new trucks, Arthur quietly attended water management workshops, studied university bulletins on watershed hydrology, and even drove 4 hours into the next state just to meet Eugene Stahl. Eugene was a legendary farmer who, back in the 1970s, had built a series of gravity-fed retention ponds that kept his entire operation thriving through droughts that broke his neighbors. Eugene had left him with a lesson he never forgot. A pond properly sited to the topography and correctly calculated for runoff can carry a whole inheritance through the darkest seasons. Arthur had been waiting for the right moment to build this hole for over 3 decades. He never explained it, because no one had ever asked with real sincerity. But the project did not go smoothly. 12 feet down, the excavator hit a layer of clay as hard as stone, burning through 2 extra days of fuel. Then, a hydraulic line blew out. The rented machine sat idle and massive right in the center of the pit for nearly a week, waiting on a replacement part shipped from out of state. On a suffocating Saturday, his daughter Clara drove out to the farm. Stepping out of her car, she looked at him with an anxious, unsettled expression, a look Arthur recognized instantly from his late wife. "Dad," the bank called. Clara hesitated. "They said you're into the operating line further than they're comfortable with for this hole." "I know," Arthur said calmly, wiping grease from his hands. "What are you going to tell them?" "They think you're throwing money into a pit." Arthur turned his head. He looked at the scarred earth, the massive, unfinished, raw-edged crater baking in the spring sun. He didn't argue. He walked into his wooden house and brought out an old weathered leather journal. It was his father's diary from 1988. Inside were no financial figures, only jagged, handwritten notes recording the day the first cow collapsed from thirst, and the days Clara's mother rationed her own sips of fresh water to save the newborn lambs. When the loan officer arrived on Monday, Arthur didn't debate hydrology. He simply laid the journal on the table and said 3 words: "This is reality." Reluctantly, faced with the cold, immovable resolve of the 71-year-old farmer, the bank signed off on a short extension. Arthur finished the rest of the work himself. No pumps, no power lines, no electricity. Just gravity and meticulous planning. He graded shallow channels along the slopes, sculpting the natural contour of the northern hillside to direct every drop of rainfall and snowmelt straight into the basin. What Arthur had built was a massive water bank with a capacity of roughly 18 million gallons, $1 to 68,000, text M, $3. He lined the overflow outlet with a heavy concrete standpipe and seeded the banks with deep-rooted native grasses to lock the soil against erosion. Spring gave way to summer, and the pond filled quietly from the late May rains. By June, it held 6 feet of water, dark and glassy in the mornings. Neighbors driving past figured Arthur was just feeling satisfied with his new fishing hole. But that same June, Gerald Fitch noticed the creek at the north edge of town running at its lowest level in 20 years. The wind began to shift, and the air coming off the Cochise Desert carried a distinct, ominous scent, the smell of scorching, dust, and impending death. By August, no one in Cochise Valley was laughing anymore. The sky felt like a red-hot iron lid clamped down over the earth. Scorching winds whipped in from the desert, blowing hum-hup like the exhaust of a blacksmith's forge. Roy Caldwell's cornfields to the east, once vibrant and tall, turned pale, brittle, and snapped under the heat waves. The wells of surrounding farms, one by one, sputtered out dry dust and went dead. Gavin Vance, the man who had mocked Arthur, was now hollow-eyed, spending thousands of dollars every day just to haul commercial water trucks to keep his Angus cattle from collapsing, their rib cages starkly visible under the blistering sun. The county extension office declared a Level 1 state of emergency. Strict bans on groundwater irrigation were enforced. The entire valley fell into a suffocating panic. Neighbors looked at one another with fearful eyes, praying for rain. But the sky remained a mocking, cloudless blue. The summer of 1988 had returned, but this time it was far more ruthless. Yet, south of County Road 7, Arthur Pendelton's water bank stood defiant. Thanks to the massive reserve captured during the spring and the perfect gravity design, his reservoir still held nearly 12 feet of water. Arthur ran gravity-fed lines directly to his pastures, keeping 200 acres hydrated. His livestock drank without restriction, their coats healthy and strong. His soybeans on the lower ground maintained a stubborn, resilient green. The pond hadn't saved everything, but it bought Arthur 8 to 10 weeks of pure survival, the critical window between a hard year and total bankruptcy. But nature wasn't done testing them. On a fateful afternoon in September, with atmospheric humidity hitting an all-time low, a dry lightning strike from a passing heat cloud struck the desiccated brush on the ridge just west of Gavin Vance's property. Within 10 minutes, the fire met the high winds and erupted into an inferno, a towering wall of flames rushing down the valley. Black smoke choked the sky like Judgment Day, turning the afternoon a blood-red hue. The wildfire advanced like a tidal wave, charging directly toward Gavin's livestock barns, where over 300 panicked Angus cattle were trapped inside the corrals. Wildfire! Help us! Frantic screams echoed across the town's emergency radio channels. 3 volunteer fire trucks rushed to the scene, sirens wailing, but as the firefighters deployed their hoses, their faces turned pale. Every local hydrant and public cistern had run completely dry the week before due to the drought. The pressure from the ranch wells was nothing but a pathetic trickle, completely useless against the monster before them. Gavin Vance stood paralyzed in the swirling ash, watching the flames lick the outer wooden walls of his barn. His cattle bellowed in terror. The death of his entire life's work, and likely his family's lives, was minutes away. Right then, an old pickup truck roared through the thick gray smoke. Arthur Pendelton stepped out, his fetid hat pulled low, his face cold and set like stone. He looked at Gavin, then at the wall of fire leaping down the ridge. "Gavin, get your people away from the north drainage ditch right now," Arthur bellowed over the roar of the fire. "You're crazy, Arthur. There is no water left to fight this." Gavin screamed through tears of despair. Arthur didn't waste a breath explaining. He sprinted to the back of his property and threw open the massive, manual mechanical iron valve of the gravity-fed canal network, connected straight to his 18-million-gallon reservoir. Cree! Clang! The rusted iron groaned under the strain as Arthur threw his entire weight into turning the valve wheel. Instantly, a deep vibration shook the ground beneath their feet. Driven by the immense pressure of millions of gallons accumulated over the spring, a torrent of cool, silt-heavy water erupted from the floodgate. It surged forward like a subterranean dragon through the network of ditches and channels Arthur had spent months meticulously grading. The deluge poured directly into the boundary ditch separating the 2 ranches, flooding the parched northern flats surrounding Gavin's threatened barns. Hiss! The moment the aggressive flames hit the property line, they found no dry brush to feed upon. Instead, the fire slammed into an improvised moat of deep water and thick, saturated mud. A colossal wall of white steam billowed into the air, blotting out the sun. The terrifying heat of the wildfire finally met its match. The 18-million-gallon current kept flowing, forming an impenetrable thermal barrier that completely severed the fire's path, saving the 300 Angus cattle and Gavin's family in the nick of time. When the fire finally died down, nothing remained on the distant ridges but smoking ash and drifting gray haze. Gavin Vance dropped to his knees in the wet mud. The pragmatic, prideful man of Cochise County was now covered in soot, his shoulders shaking with emotion. He looked up at Arthur, who was quietly leaning against the hood of his old truck, watching the faint trail of smoke from his cigarette drift away. I thought you were crazy, Arthur," Gavin choked out, his voice raw. "I mocked you to the whole town." Arthur didn't look down at him. His eyes remained fixed on the surface of his reservoir. It had drawn down by a third of its volume, but it still gleamed, beautifully reflecting the final golden rays of the setting sun. "I didn't dig this hole to prove you wrong, Gavin," Arthur said, his voice as calm and steady as the deep water. "I dug it because I remembered the summer of 1988. This land can feed us, but it will take everything back if we forget how to respect it." That autumn, the Cochise County Extension Office hosted a special symposium titled On-Farm Resilience and Sustainable Watershed Management. Gerald Fitch stood at the podium alongside the state's top hydrologist. The meeting room, usually empty for such topics, was packed so tightly that people stood overflowing into the hallways. Arthur Pendelton sat quietly in the very back row, his worn hat resting on his knee. When the meeting adjourned, dozens of young, eager farmers bypassed the academic speakers and surrounded the old man not to scoff, but to ask for his phone number, to learn about slope grading, and to ask permission to walk his land and study his design. The following spring, Gavin Vance was the first to hire an excavator, breaking ground on a reservoir of his own. Then came Roy Caldwell, followed by 7 other operations across the valley. The county's annual agricultural report featured a dedicated section on-farm water retention and gravity-fed watersheds. Maxine Trotter quietly took a copy of that report, placed it inside a beautiful glass frame, and hung it directly behind the register at the feed store for everyone to see. Arthur never once bragged or told anyone, "I told you so." He wasn't that kind of man. But whenever young farmers stopped by his porch, asking with reverence how he had accurately predicted such a brutal drought to prepare so perfectly, the 71-year-old farmer would simply smile gently, pointing his calloused hand toward the harsh, ancient ridges of the Cochise Valley. "I didn't predict a thing," Arthur said softly. "I just chose not to forget." The great agricultural philosopher Masanobu Fukuoka once wrote, "The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings." Arthur Pendelton never set out to teach anyone a lesson. He merely protected what he had spent his life building with quiet memory and patient planning. But through that life-giving current in the dead of a fiery summer, he planted something in the hearts of his community far deeper than water. He showed them that preparation is not pessimism, that long-term vision is not stubbornness, and that sometimes the wisest decision of a lifetime looks, from the outside, exactly like an old man digging himself a fishing pond. The land teaches these lessons very slowly, and only to those willing to listen.
Subscribe.